Good morning. Ohayo gozaimasu. And good afternoon in case of Vancouver. Welcome to the online symposium titled Transformative Change for Building a Sustainable Society and Forests, organized by Sophia University Human Resources Center for International Cooperation, SHIRIC, and co-hosted by Sophia University InnoFest project. As you know, today's theme is too huge to be discussed within a few hours' time, but today we have many participants of the general public, in addition to the experts, researchers, practitioners, and students interested in this subject. So I hope we can approach this important theme by sharing some useful tips and clues for changing our behaviors and the society. My name is Shingo Shibata with Sophia University. I'm going to navigate today's symposium. どうぞよろしくお願いいたします。Before starting, I would like to ask participants a few things. To all participants, except speakers and panelists, if you have any questions or comments to the speakers, please put them in Q&A box. We will do best to pick them up during the session, but please understand that we may not be able to pick all of them. There are two language channels, English and Japanese. Original voices are mostly English, and you can listen to Japanese translation by adjusting translation button. But some original voices may be in Japanese. In that case, please adjust translation button appropriately. Both your video camera and mic are muted by the Secretariat. Recordings by the participants are prohibited, so your cooperation is appreciated. Okay, now let's start by inviting Professor Yasuhiro Ueki, Director, Sophia University Human Resources Center for International Cooperation, SHIRIC, for the opening address. Professor Ueki, please.
Good morning to the Japanese audience, and good morning, good afternoon to the expert participants in Fiji and Vancouver, Canada. I'm Professor Yasuhiro Ueki of Sophia University and the Director of the Sophia Human Resources Center for International Cooperation. On behalf of Sophia University, I would like to extend a warm welcome to the speakers and participants at the symposium on transformative change for building a sustainable society and forests. This symposium is one of the main events in the 16th UN Weeks, which we have organized with support from the United Nations Information Center in Tokyo. During this 2-week period, we take up a number of global challenges facing the international community. Forestry and biodiversity is one of these important topics. The 2019 Global Assessment Report on Biodiversity and Ecosystems Services, which the Intergovernmental Science Policy Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystems published, draws our attention to nature's contribution to our lives and alerts us to the deteriorating conditions of our natural environment and impact on our ecosystems. Japan has been on the forefront of preserving nature and our diversity while pursuing sustainable development. In 2010, Japan hosted the International Biodiversity Conference in Nagoya, Aichi Prefecture, which adopted the Aichi Biodiversity Targets. Earlier, the 1992 Biodiversity Convention had recognized that biodiversity is not just about plants animals, and microorganisms and their ecosystems. It's about a community of people and our need for food security, medicine, fresh air and water, shelter, and a clean and healthy environment in which to live. As an essential part of our environment, forests play a crucial role. As you know, forests are considered the lungs of the earth, as they take in carbon dioxide and produce oxygen. Forests cover approximately 1/3 of the land surface. 54% of the all global forests are in 5 countries: Brazil, Canada, China, Russia, and the United States. In the case of Japan, 67% of the country's landmass is covered by forests. According to the Global Forest Resources Assessment Report, published by the Food and Agriculture Organization of the United Nations, UNFAO, the area of primary forest has decreased by 81 million hectares globally since 1990. Largest forest losses are seen in Africa and Latin America, while Asia has a net gain thanks to sustainable forest management. Good forest management is not just a technical issue, but it's also crucial for the health of our communities and the broader global society. At the outset of our symposium, I would like to thank Professor Shingo Shibata of our university for coordinating this important forum with prominent speakers and panelists. Without further delay, I'd like to hand over the moderation to Professor Shibata. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you very much, Professor Ueki. Now I would like to introduce today's speakers. First keynote speaker is Dr. Kai Chan, Professor, University of British Columbia, Canada. As you know, Professor Chan is a coordinating lead author of Chapter 5 of 2019 IPBES Global Assessment Report. Thank you, Professor Chan, for attending during a tight schedule. Due to his next schedule, Professor Chan can stay with us for 1 hour only. Second keynote speaker and first panelist is Mr. Hiroto Mitsugi, former Assistant Director General of the UN Food and Agriculture Organization, FAO. Thank you, Mr. Mitsugi, for attending during a tight schedule before another important event. Also, Dr. Lawrence Pogendorf, Associate Professor, Department of International Tourism Management Studies, Toyo University. Lawrence Sensei, again, is quite a busy person. Thank you very much for your kind attendance. Next, Dr. Yasuko Inoue, RED Plus and Forest-Based Disaster Risk Reduction Research and Development Center, Forestry and Forest Products Research Institute of Japan. Dr. Inoue, thank you very much for your attendance. Lastly, Ms. Salanieta Tusuba, lecturer, Fiji National University. Salar is also a PhD candidate at Sophia University. Thank you very much, Salar, for your attendance today. Now, I would like to invite the first keynote speaker, Professor Kai Chan. 2 years have passed since the IPBES report, and he will update the current situation, incorporating newly emerged COVID crisis. His lecture title is How We Can Achieve Transformative Change in the COVID-19 Era. Professor Chan, please.
Wonderful. Thank you so much, Professor Shingo Shibata, for that Wonderful invitation, the wonderful invitation, and also that introduction. And thank you also to Professor Ueki for your excellent introductory remarks. It's a real pleasure to be with you today. I wish that I could participate in more of the event because it's clearly going to be very interesting. Unfortunately, the time is such that this is the very end of my workday, and so I'll only be able to be here for this 1 hour. The topic at hand is, of course, transformative change. And this is addressing directly both the climate and ecological crises. I want to bring you back in time. I hope everything is okay. You can see my screen and hear me. Maybe if you can give me a thumbs up if that's the case. All right, I assume that you can. It was 2 years ago that much of the world woke up to the news that up to 1 million species are at risk of extinction due to human activities. There was a whole bunch of media coverage to this effect. Following the publication or the release of the summary for policymakers of the IPBES, or also called IPBES, global assessment, standing for the Intergovernmental Platform on Biodiversity and Ecosystem Services. The swell of media was tremendous. So in just the first 3 weeks prior to that release, 49 different languages, 164 countries, over 8,000 news sites featured over 25,000 articles. And that's just the online media, not including print media, radio, television, podcasts, all the rest. And so just in that online articles, that was already a circulation of over 19 billion, meaning that on average, each person on the planet would have seen this more than twice. That fit in with a groundswell of concern about addressing the climate and ecological crises. And so in many parts of the world, including here in Vancouver, where I took these pictures, there were climate marches that drew hundreds of thousands of people. It was unprecedented in that respect. And again, addressing both climate change with, as represented by this sign, this is a bad sign of this earth on fire, and then also the ecological crises, represented by some of these other signs that you can see. That was the fall of 2019. And then of course, COVID struck. And despite the fact that COVID is actually itself almost certainly a zoonotic disease, and despite the fact that the very same causes, societal causes that contribute to the ecological and climate crises gave rise to this being a global pandemic and all of its negative effects. Nevertheless, COVID also worked to directly interrupt the momentum that was building to address the climate and ecological crises. This has so many different dimensions. I don't really have time to dig into most of them. You know, in the first case, it was almost certainly the wildlife trade that gave rise to the opportunities for this disease to escape some animal species and make its way into human populations that caused this in the first place. And then our hyper-connectedness and our inability to act in a precautionary way to prevent this disease from escaping. These are just two of the same societal causes that make us so vulnerable to the ecological and climate crises. So in this talk, I'm going to go through some of the highlights of the global assessment, and I'm going to really draw out this idea of transformative change and what it means. I want to bring it all the way back to that room in Paris where the negotiations occurred that had the summary for policymakers recognize the need for transformative change to achieve global goals. And then I'm going to steer the conversation towards a need for civic action. That is you and I, you and me, and so many others. And then talk about the possibility of a new kind of movement that enlists people to take those kinds of powerful civic actions, not the ones that are so distracting that have been called for decades past. So the global assessment is the largest and most comprehensive, the most authoritative report of its kind. It followed after the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment from 2005, but in this case, just like the IPCC, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, where those two are sister organizations in the UN family, this is now an official intergovernmental process with member countries that request each of these outputs. So the global assessment was requested by the nations, and then indeed the summary for policymakers was negotiated by the nations and released by the nations, representing their view, not just the view of scientists. Some of the messages were really dire. This graph represents the levels of threat of a wide variety of different groups of living organisms. And I'm not going to belabor it because probably many of you have seen this before, or at least heard the outcomes. This is where the million species at risk estimate comes from, including those many species that are not known, where their status is not known. So you can see the ones where it is known in the red, orange, and ochre colors, and then the light green and darker green, where the warmer colors are different levels of threat according to the IUCN Red List categories. And what you can see here is striking, that for many of these groups of organisms, it's not a small fraction of them that are threatened with extinction. And if you look at this in terms of a time trend, you can see that since 1500, we've had a rapid acceleration, and this looks like an exponential curve in an increase in species that have been driven extinct. Right? Fortunately, these are relatively small percentages at the moment. But when you flip the graph to where upwards would be good on this graph, according to the Red List Index of Species Survival, you can see that on a much compressed temporal scale, some of these groups are actually declining substantially in terms of their species survival, even over decades, which is really alarming. Those are just statistics, but I want to bring you into some particular stories that are really compelling to many people. There is a pod of, or rather a kind of a subspecies, I think it's a subspecies of orcas, certainly a distinct population of orcas in the Salish Sea, right around Vancouver and also Seattle, that used to number in the hundreds, but now is down to just 74 animals. They're really on their last legs. And 3 years ago, one of the maternal orcas, her name is J35, but I call her Jess because I think she deserves a real name, gave birth to a calf that was apparently stillborn. And she carried this calf around on her snout for 17 days, as if she was communicating her grief to the world and maybe even also holding us somewhat responsible for the fact that it had been years since that population had had a viable baby make it to the age of 1 year old. So this species is one of those, or subspecies is one of those groups that is at risk of extinction. Coral reefs. Some of my colleagues are coral reef scientists, and they report that the reefs that they have been studying for many years that used to look like this, that so many of them look like this, or even, covered in algae. This is actually the picture of a reef that has relatively recently bleached and still has the chance at some recovery. But these look like graveyards in so many cases, and approximately 50% of coral reefs have already been lost, which is, again, alarming and absolutely distressing, to the point where at many coral reef meetings, scientists are just in tears at what is happening and the dire prognosis looking forward. Clearly, this is not just about wildlife. This is also about what wildlife does for us, what ecosystems do for us. So it's worth noting that just one category of nature's contributions to people or ecosystem services, 91 of 107 global crop types rely on animal pollination, and so are vulnerable to interruption in terms of the production if we continue to lose wild pollinators as we are doing. And this service has been estimated through robust methods at somewhere between 235 and 570 billion dollars per year. So a tremendous sum. When you look across the categories of these nature's contributions to people, and in terms of how metrics of the viability of these ecosystem services are doing across different regions of the globe, you can see that there are many that are decreasing. They're losing status in a sense. They're losing health or viability in at least some, if not many, regions of the world. There are some that are starkly decreasing and regularly across many regions, and then there are others where there's some variability with few of no change and no examples of uniform increases. There are 3 examples here where some of the metrics point towards some positive trends in some regions. Unfortunately, for 2 of these, so for energy and for food and feed, these are actually not measures of ecological integrity. These are actually measures of the percentage of arable land that is being grown in crops and in biofuels, respectively. So not a measure of how well our ecosystems are doing, but rather of the scale of the human enterprise that is manipulating these ecosystems for our immediate needs. And this loss of nature's contributions to people has real material consequences for us and for people who are less fortunate than us, where many of us might think about tropical hardwoods in terms of the beautiful furniture, teak or mahogany, or the solid wood floors that we might use in our houses, without recognizing that those extraction events in so many cases can trigger landslides or mudslides like this that can bury whole villages, including a loss of massive amounts of property as well as people's lives, interrupting those lives considerably. This, of course, has consequences also, so logging in general, as well as the mudslides or landslides as depicted here, have consequences for so many critters, including this white-ruffed manakin, which is a forest-dependent bird species, photographed here from Costa Rica. And then also even way downstream in coral reefs, where the sedimentation and the loss of nitrogen and phosphorus from terrestrial ecosystems goes to fuel a growth of macroalgae that can choke coral reefs, and so greatly reduce their productivity. So this report, and I realize that I'm telling you only a lot of bad news. I promise we'll get to some good news before too long. This report also revealed how we were doing in terms of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the Aichi targets for biodiversity. And I'm not going to show you these particular findings, but to say that basically it's the same kind of story that I showed you before, where there's a lot of bad news, some of it variable, and very little good news. And that which good news that does exist is also variable across places. The scenarios and models, so I've walked you through, in a sense, several of the chapters here of the global assessment. The first chapter set the stage for all the rest, introduced readers to the ideas of nature's contributions to people and to the purpose of doing an assessment like this. Chapter 2, I just reported on several parts of that, which was the status and trends of nature, nature's contributions to people, and the drivers of change of both of those. Chapter 3 was the progress and prognosis. Oh, I should say this chapter 2, was effectively the Millennium Ecosystem Assessment in a nutshell, all in one chapter that had 3 parts. I just told you about chapter 3, which was the progress and prognosis towards the goals. And then chapter 4 was about scenarios and models, and revealed that of all of the quantitatively specified scenarios and models that we had available, there was not a single one that showed us on track, even with marginal changes, that showed humanity as being collectively on track for the full set of UN Sustainable Development Goals, or even just the subset of nature-related ones. So it was in that context that chapter 5 came in, which was to say, just because the models don't show that being possible does not mean that it is not possible. So let's imagine that we do at some point in the future achieve the vision of the world we want, as according to the Rio +20 process and the UN Sustainable Development Goals, even if it might be a little late. What might that world look like, and how do we get there from here? We asked in a backcasting analysis. And chapter 6 followed up on that with a more in-depth look at policy options, obstacles, and opportunities. This chapter 5 was the chapter that I had the pleasure to work on. It wasn't always pleasurable, I have to say, but it was sure a heck of a lot more pleasurable than it would have been to work on any of these earlier chapters, which just reported on, really depressing news. So in this chapter, the way that we proceeded was to recognize that achieving the full set of UN Sustainable Development Goals is a complex task. You can divvy up the part where nature enters in one form or another into 6 different foci. One of them here is balancing food provision from the oceans and the coasts along with nature provision. We also have to meet climate goals while maintaining nature and its contributions to people from the land. We need to feed humanity while also maintaining nature on land. And we need to, in a concrete way, conserve and restore nature while contributing positively to human well-being, rather than removing people from the places where that's happening, as has unfortunately been so frequently the case in national parks and other protected areas. We need to resource our growing cities while also maintaining the nature that underpins them, including that which occurs within city boundaries. And we need to maintain freshwater for both nature and humanity. This is how the literature broke out, where there were separate literatures that addressed different foci. And what was interesting is that each of these literatures looks at some interactions, right? And that's expressed in the language here. For example, it's not just feeding humanity, it's feeding humanity, but still also paying attention to the nature that is directly there in terrestrial ecosystems. But what's also important, and which we dug into in our nexus analysis, is that there are also really important interactions that did not get much space in the literature between these foci. For example, there are strategies that seem to be effective at feeding humanity without degrading terrestrial biodiversity that put too much of an emphasis on industrial agriculture, including large inputs of pesticides and fertilizers, and the treatment of soils, that all of which incurred major losses of fresh water, both because a huge amount of water was used for irrigation and because those agricultural chemicals and sediments degraded the water quality downstream. So it was necessary to think not just about how to achieve each of these 6 goals separately, but how indeed to achieve them together, accounting for the negative externalities of some of the solutions. This part of our chapter concluded that many things were needed. We needed much more protected area and much more restoration. We needed to have sustainable practices in forestry, agriculture, fisheries, etc. We needed to have a clean energy economy and a rapid transition towards that, plus carbon capture and storage. We needed to have multi-stakeholder land use and coastal planning all over the world. But how then could that all be accomplished? And none of the scenario and backcasting analyses, pathway analyses that we consulted contained a full set of explanations for how we might achieve all of these really difficult societal interventions simultaneously. Accordingly, what we did, and we realizing that this was likely what we were going to find, we separated the chapter's work into two different parts. What I've told you about so far is this nexus analysis of scenarios. Our group, the 22 of us, which is the lead authors and the coordinating lead authors like myself, we met first and drafted a set of cross-cutting interventions that might enable the kind of work on the direct drivers that I just explained. Based on that, we then divvied up our work into two separate parts, the nexus analysis of scenarios, and then also a series of expert-led literature reviews, each of which followed from this initial set of levers and leverage points that we assembled as a group. We then had 4 more meetings represented here and 4 drafts, each of which was reviewed, first internally and then 3 externally. And where we had to, in all of these 3 subsequent drafts, we had to respond to every single review, every single comment. From that set of expert-led literature reviews, we distilled the final set of IPBES levers and leverage points, which became part of the summary for policymakers and is now a foundation for thinking about global transformative change. I don't have time to talk about all of these, but I will just say that you can think about the levers as governance interventions. They include a reform of incentive structures that includes eliminating or reforming all subsidies that have negative effects environmentally. It also includes a widespread uptake, a widespread increase in environmental law and its consistent and transparent enforcement within nations and across nations. The leverage points are the various points for intervention where the levers are especially important, but where a variety of other tools might also come into play, and which are all necessary, it seemed, for sustainable pathways. One of these is reducing total consumption and waste. It appears to be impossible to achieve that vision of the UN Sustainable Development Goals and the end of post-2020 framework for biodiversity without reining in and even eventually reducing the aggregate consumption and waste that we incur as a species. This includes both per capita consumption, which is a product, of course, of societal structures and systems, and also human population size. And so the solutions are different in different places. But reducing total consumption and waste is not possible in and of itself. It also requires that we attend specifically to the notions of a successful life, where Western notions of a life that is very high in material consumption, that incurs a massive amount of resource extraction and production activities, that incurs pollution and other forms of degradation to ecosystems. Those visions need to evolve to be able to recognize the empirical reality that we know that good lives do not need to entail high levels of material consumption. Indeed, there are societies where it's quite normal for people to live lives that are celebrated despite their low material consumption. The third is about unleashing values in action. And that one is especially important because so many of the pathways that we encountered and reviewed in this chapter assumed that behavior change could take place in a widespread across the globe without explaining how that might come about. And so there was a real gap there. And one piece that was clearly needed was to recognize that we don't necessarily need to have a widespread change in values triggering the change in behavior, but we need, because indeed it seems that many of the values that are consistent with much more responsible behaviors are already widespread in many populations. What we need is the change in societal norms and infrastructure institutions that enables people to act on those values, where at the moment, many of those social and institutional factors are actually working against people expressing those values. Now, that's a ton of concepts. There are nations that have put together several of these levers and leverage points together in some partial but really important successes. And our chapter detailed some of these. I'm not going to go into details here, but they include the community-based conservation programs in Namibia, Sweden, for a broad range of initiatives, including recognition of a human right to a healthy environment, Costa Rica for their forest protection and the same recognition, as well as broad investments in environmental and sustainability education, the US for the Endangered Species Act, Seychelles for a variety of things, including marine protection, and again, the right to a healthy environment, and then also New Zealand. That's not all of the success stories, but it's a handful of them, coming from nations of very different levels of development and income. We proposed that there were several different pathways to assemble these levers and leverage points together in terms of transformative change. But together they seem to all involve a transformation towards a global sustainable economy. These ideas were extremely contentious, not just within the author team, which was really, I think, just preemptive to try to mitigate the conflict that some of the co-chairs knew would arise from discussing these contentious issues in concrete terms. One of the chapters of the Summary for Policymakers, D10, it was here on the slide that on this picture where I am in a rare smiling moment as captured by Shizuka Hashimoto, one of my Japanese colleagues. This paragraph contained several of the most important concrete elements of transformative change in terms of what was needed to bring about a global sustainable economy. They included the transformation or reformation of subsidies, which is so important but also controversial, included carbon taxes and other price signals about resource extraction and pollution, and making those consistent across jurisdictions. It included moving away from the GDP as a measure of economic progress or of well-being. And so many of these ideas evoked strong reactions from some nations. One in particular, whose name shall go unmentioned, who has since had a change in government, who requested that we delete the paragraph in its entirety. And it was over many days in Paris, 4 days of negotiations, that we managed to negotiate with that team, thanks to the lobbying of several other nations that saw this as a cornerstone of the move towards a sustainable pathway. So this, in the end, although this paragraph was deleted 3 times in the course of our revisions, it did eventually make it through and contain all of these important elements, recognizing by all these nations the need for these really concrete steps. But this story, although we were successful in the end with only little edits to the wording, this story gives a little bit of a window into the kind of obstacles by governments and by industry that we will encounter on the path towards transformative change. The reason is, of course, that many institutions, again, including governments and also industry, are not in the business of transformative change, but rather in the business of incremental change and protecting themselves from transformative change. So any kind of widespread system change is seen first and foremost as a threat by many of these institutions. So this work is not going to be easy. Recognizing this, several of the other authors of the global assessment and I, while we were sitting in that room in Paris in the negotiations, wrote this petition, a citizen's call for a global sustainable economy, to give people a sense of what they could do, right? Because the work to be done here involves needing to move nations and national governments, et cetera, and businesses, but that they will not, almost certainly, and have not in the 2 years since, just picked up this message and ran with it. They have not taken these kinds of actions. Just as I imagine what has happened based on that experience, what has happened since is that many governments have talked about transformative change, but in most cases, they have used that language to justify incremental change, not the transformative change called for, especially in that D10 paragraph of the summary for policymakers. So this citizens' call calls for governments and industry to implement all components of the global sustainable economy, including reining in the power of business and overcoming vested interests in law and policymaking via enhanced and strategic civic and consumer action. Now, this was not a petition like your normal petitions. We didn't have a concrete single ask that is really necessary. It was instead intended just as a rallying point to start to assemble a community of people who realize the magnitude of the challenge and who want to work towards that. So in a subsequent blog post that was actually the first blog on the IPBES website, the IPBES website, I laid out concretely the 5 steps that seem to be most important now to move towards transformative change. And they are here. I'm gonna let you just read that while I take a moment and drink some water. Since then, as I mentioned, now 2 and almost 2.5 years have passed. We have evidence of an unjust, unsustainable, and inequitable trajectory that is only continuing now and only worsening with COVID. Governments have agreed that transformative change is needed. It's becoming a regular part of conversations at the UN, including over the draft framework for the post-2020 framework for biodiversity. Many people, governments and NGOs are using the ideas of transformative change to advance incremental change. The big changes remain virtually untouched. I talked earlier briefly about one of those leverage points, about the need to unleash values of responsibility into widespread action and social norms. In that context, I'm not talking, as we usually do in the environmental movement, I'm not talking about intrinsic and instrumental values. The 2 categories of values that were the ones that it seemed like the IPBES framework, conceptual framework, it was only going to recognize these 2. Where intrinsic values are the value that nature has independent of what matters to us as people. And instrumental values are basically the benefits, the value of the benefits that we derive from nature and from our interactions with nature. In 2013, during that conceptual framework workshop in Cape Town of IPBES, I argued, after having had a series of really stimulating conversations with colleagues like Barbara Maraca and Kurt Jacks and Terry Satterfield, I brought into that room the argument that it's not just intrinsic and instrumental values that matter. It's also the principles, preferences, and virtues that we as humans have about our relationships with nature, including our attachment to particular places, including our ideas of responsibility and what is appropriate, and also our ideas of what makes for a good and fulfilling life. All of these ideas are relational values, not just directly with nature, but also between people where nature is an intermediary. So another part of the environmental values literature has distinguished between held values, which are very abstract, broad ideals like courage, fairness, honesty, loyalty, and assigned values like the value of a lake for the ecosystem services it provides. In that space, we also need to recognize relational values, which are these ideas about appropriate relationships. I promised I'd end on a hopeful note. Those are tall orders, and I bet that just talking about them in the abstract, it's not clear how we might engage those relational values in order to bring about the kind of transformative change needed. What I think is needed is a community of actors who bond together, who recognize that so many of us are in the work of transformative change, or at least of sustainability or sustainable development, but we're working on very different isolated pieces where none of those pieces could ever be fully successful without transformative change. And yet none of us have the capacity to bring about a change that big on our own. None of us as individuals, no one institution, organization, or government. So this initiative that we're launching this fall, called CoSphere, for a community of small planet heroes, seeks to provide that community, a coalition of people who all see that this is necessary and who want to work towards that change that is bigger than us. Our vision is for humanity to become nature positive, actively supporting a sustainable future in which people live in harmony with nature. Our mission is to make it easy, enjoyable, and empowering to initiate and support transformative change towards sustainable practices and societies. It involves identifying how different levers and leverage points can be engaged to change these 6 different fundamental systems that need transformation. And this is integrating insights from the IPBES global assessment, as well as also the UNEP Making Peace with Nature report that I had the pleasure to be one of the section leads for as well. A part of our challenge here is to do a much better job of engaging people. In the environmental movement, so many people have felt that their job is to buy things differently, or to commute differently, to walk to school or work, to bike to work, to take public transit instead of driving a car, right? All of these private actions, which are actually really strongly constrained by societal norms, as well as institutions and infrastructure. We have very limited power to make large changes to our private actions. And yet that's what most people have come to understand is what's needed for sustainability. What's needed arguably instead is for us to simultaneously engage 3 different kinds of individual actions. The private actions, which we need to do to a degree in order not to be seen as hypocrites, but also the social signaling actions like sharing campaigns, like standing up for values, like going to protests and talking about those protests and talking about climate change and talking about luxury, as well as the work to change systems through voting, through advocacy and activism. We need to do all three of these things together so that we're doing our part, but also making it much easier and normal for others to do their part. One concrete example of this, and I'm going to wrap up very soon because I'm at 40 minutes now, is ideas about luxury. We have inherited these notions, as I said, that luxury, a life of luxury and leisure is a good thing, that we should aspire to that. It doesn't actually produce high levels of well-being. And yet we continue to have this fascination with celebrities and with uber rich people. When it doesn't, it's injurious to people, especially young girls, for example, on social media, as reported last week about Facebook and Instagram, but also to all of us in terms of undermining our ability to live a good life with confidence that that is a good life. So what we can do as individuals is we can start to reshape these social norms so that we endorse and live with and celebrate the living of a life that does not entail luxury, a large amount of luxury and leisure, but small luxuries and small leisures in the course of a life of service. And that should be normal across all of humanity. When you think about taking this kind of action, I imagine that you feel very much alone. I imagine that you wonder who else will join. And I want you to, in this moment, imagine Greta Thunberg in her first days, where she was alone. But realize now that there are millions of people around the world who are eager to get started on this hard action. Greta paved the way for so many to get active in this space. So you are not alone. To sum up, we need deep transformative change for the climate and for life on Earth, and to address pandemics like COVID. Civic action in this context is more crucial than ever. Bold and unrelenting action, well organized, working together, perhaps with CoSphere. I'd love to hear from you, and thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very informative and thought-provoking lecture, including backgrounds of struggles of international negotiations. Now we have Q&A session. We already have one question from the floor, so I will pick it up. And also, if other panelists have any questions, please raise hands. First question. 最初の質問、声を上げる、議論するというのは、日本人が非常に苦手なことなのですが、どうすれば世界についていけるのでしょうか。I think this is a general question that how we can be more internationally oriented. Japanese are grown up in an island archipelago, and generally we are not very good at be open and discussion with internationally. So do you have any advice?
I missed part of the question because I was a little late in switching to the interpretation channel, but I think I heard the gist of the question. I think it's a good one. I think that Japan has come a long way in this respect, actually, over recent years. Following the tsunami of a few years ago, Japan had an unprecedented response in terms of my experience of the world, which was to feature, to initiate science and also recovery efforts that cleaned up the mess that came from debris that was washed into the oceans as a result of the tsunami, as well as to document, to understand the distribution of those and to take account of them. It was, it's one example of several that I've seen of Japan trying to take a good, a civic responsibility position on the global stage. So, I think that's, I use that example as a model of exactly what you're talking about, of reaching beyond one's own boundaries. I think we need to do more of that in terms of some of the issues that are most structural in terms of the global economy. So, for example, carbon pricing regimes are not normal yet. And one of the things that impedes nations taking strong and comprehensive carbon tax rules or carbon pricing rules is the fact that other nations, the fear, and we have this in Canada, that other nations will undercut them by providing the same goods. Here we worry about oil and gas and aluminum, that will provide, but also others, will provide the same goods more cheaply if they don't have to pay carbon prices, right? So this is just one of several examples where we really need to have a cooperation to bring on these kinds of carbon pricing and other kinds of pricing rules at the same time to facilitate a global response, not a nation by nation response. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Professor Chan, for response. At the moment, there is no other questions. So I will ask one question. I understand that transformative change is fundamentally different from incremental change, as you mentioned. So how do you define the difference?
Yeah, I'm glad that you brought that up, because there are often misunderstandings about this. Transformative change is a whole system-wide change that includes economic, societal, political factors, and that reaches to the level of paradigms, goals, and values. Now, that doesn't mean, so you can work towards that kind of transformative change through some actions that might feel incremental, right? So a slow reform of subsidies, as one example, it would feel incremental. It would be incremental if it was done incrementally. And yet, its effect would absolutely be transformative. It might only be possible to do that kind of a widespread reform in a stepwise incremental way, right? So it might seem incremental, but it can absolutely, if it is structural in the right direction, it can be transformative towards sustainability. That's why I hope that the levers and the leverage points help to identify where incremental change at the levers or the leverage points can contribute to transformative change.
Thank you. Thank you for your explanation. Another question from the floor. It's a long question. 現在、世界各国でコロナ禍が落ち着きつつあり、経済が急回復しているようです。このためか、化石燃料の引き合いが強くなり、争奪戦の様相を呈していることから、価格が急騰していると聞き及びます。生物多様性保全や気候変動への対応と逆行していると思いますが、どのように対応されますかというのが質問です。よろしくお願いします。
Yeah, it's true. Initially, with the COVID pandemic, with the lockdowns, we saw a drop in prices, and now we're seeing a bounce back, and the interruptions to supply chains coupled with high and increasing levels of demand are causing a spike in fossil fuel prices. This is really important to address for sure. One part of our answer should be to prevent some of the most aggressive pro-development measures taking place. So here in Canada, it's being used as an argument to open up new pipelines, for example. But you know, we need to be careful not to take that kind of an action, because in many cases it would likely not be worthwhile. So these supply chain interruptions are not going to last forever. They're not going to last that long, I would argue. And so what we're seeing a blip, basically. It's a transient effect that will diminish. Simultaneously, though, we need to bring on a suite of new technologies that will allow global energy prices to stabilize more. And so these are renewable energy technologies that are available, but just need to be brought on along with battery technologies, which are necessary to supplement those renewable energies.
Thank you very much. So let me ask another question. I'm interested to know what are generally conceivable actions or prescriptions to start with for notions of successful life or behavior change in Canada, or China or some other country?
So I don't know that I have the best answers to this, but I do have an answer as to how we will get some answers. So I think that the best approaches need to be trialed in with groups, in social media fora, for example, in real live groups of people. I don't know what's going to resonate in terms of promoting the idea that a simpler life can be a really good one. What I do know is that the approaches that we've used to date that seem to signal that, a simple life is a life of deprivation, that those are not helpful, right? That we don't have to be tree huggers. We don't have to wear Birkenstock sandals in order to live a good, simple life, right? So we need to model a wide variety of different ways that many of us are actually seeking to live simple lives and benefiting from that. We need to be explicit about that, and we need to start to make it normal to share the fact that we are making these moves, that we are committing to a life that does entail less consumption and that we are happy doing it. And I think when we do that, some of those ways that people share those ideas and some of the particular ideas for low material consumption lives are going to resonate really well. And those are going to be the answers to your question. I have my ways, right? Like I cycle to work, I buy clothes, I patch them up. And many of the clothes that I have, I've had for 20 plus years. I'm happy doing that. I find it meditative, but I don't know if those are the things that are going to resonate with people,
Thank you very much. While waiting another question, I ask another question. I'm surprised to know from my Chinese students that majority of population in China contribute to grow Alipay and forest. And also I found it interesting that the Canadian apparel company plant trees worldwide, from boreal to mangroves, for each sale of clothes. Can we consider these initiatives as nature positive? And do you have any suggestion to bringing this concept into mainstream?
Could you just repeat what the Chinese
Ant forest, Alibaba ant forest in China I hear that 60% or 70%, maybe majority of Chinese populations contribute to grow and to forest.
Okay, I see. To restore forests.
Yes, I think in the northern Tibet area,
Okay.
or the desertification area.
And associated with purchases on Alibaba,
Yes.
is that what you're
Yes,
saying?
yes.
Yeah, yeah.
And they collect points and
yeah, great. Again, that's a super topic for conversation. I didn't unpack the idea of what it means to be nature positive. I would consider the contribution to the restoration to be nature positive. However, when you think about the purchase plus the contribution to restoration of forests, that together is probably not reaching the level of nature positive, because it's probably not addressing the range of negative impacts that are associated with the purchase, right? So any purchase of a product entails the extraction of natural resources from many different places on the planet, the production that incurs pollution and other forms of harm, environmental degradation in other parts of the planet. So planting forests is a good thing, right? But it isn't enough to mitigate all of those other impacts. So it's moving towards nature positive, but we need to do more. We need to make sure, first of all, that all of our purchases are carbon neutral, basically, and also start to grapple with the place-based effects associated with resource extraction and production.
Thank you very much. Another question in Japanese from 補助金削減は非常に抵抗があると思います。どのような方法で実現できると思われますか？どのような方法でイプベスでは提案されていますか？という質問です。よろしくお願いします。
Absolutely. Decreasing subsidies would absolutely have pushback, and it would be a very negative outcome, or bring about many negative outcomes if we were to simply just end subsidies. Subsidies play a really important role. What I'm talking about here is to remove some subsidies and to reform many subsidies. And so as an example of that, I'll just take fossil fuel subsidies, where at the moment, fossil fuel subsidies are in many cases larger than, larger than some of the subsidies for renewable energy, such that they are distorting those energy markets and preventing some of the renewable energy technologies from really taking off. So clearly something needs to change there. If we were to end fossil fuel subsidies overnight, it would be devastating to many economies for a range of reasons. And so what's needed instead is to put that money towards transitioning both workers and also industry towards a different kind of technology, right? And at the moment, at least in Canada, most of those subsidies does not go to people, it goes to large companies. And so what we need to do is we need to put some of it towards paying for workers to be retrained, and then to supplement, to spark new initiatives that can grow and provide new employment in other sectors of the economy, especially in clean energy and clean technology.
Thank you very much. Another question. 関係性の価値を見出していく点、大変興味深いです。その中でこの関係性の価値を考えていく、議論する上では、評価していくということも重要になると思います。関係性を評価すること自体への重要性へのコメントや評価軸や方法について教えていただきたいです。
Yes, absolutely. So relational values have two different roles here. One is eudaimonic values. So this is a subclass of relational values, which are the contributions of relationships with things and places and other beings towards good, fulfilling lives. They're like instrumental values, except for two different points. One, that they acknowledge that not all contributions are substitutable. Some contributions are actually constituents of a good life, where it's not, you can't replace it with something else. And the second is to recognize that a good life is not just one that is the product of the satisfaction of many preferences, but also one that involves living in accordance with our principles. So the way that we calculate well-being and the impact of relational values on well-being is different, but similar to the way that we might calculate instrumental values contributing to well-being. So in that context, we don't have much in the way of tools for evaluation that have been tested properly. We do have some that I know about coming from the cultural ecosystem services literature, for example, where we can start to get people to tell us how much things matter in relation to other things without putting dollar figures on it, in a way that we can interpret relative importance to well-being. But there will still be a role for economic valuation for sure. Okay, so it's not going to replace economic valuation, but rather supplement it as being a kind of valuation that is much closer to well-being in reality. But I also want to say that the other class of relational values is not about valuation, right? It's about the societal debate about what are appropriate ways that we ought to engage with nature. And so those kinds of values are ones that they're principles and they're moral virtues that we should debate together, that we should identify, we should come to decide as a group, what is appropriate and what is not appropriate, given the nature of the consequences of our individual and collective actions.
Thank you. We have some more questions, but next one is, because of time, next one will be the last one. Recently, I've been researching about Amazon rainforest. I know there was big fire and the president treated with the problem correctly, giving priority to the economic. How do you think about it? Should Brazil have acted differently?
Absolutely. The situation in Brazil is terrible. I'll just say that frankly. The fires were a product of government action, or rather explicit and conspicuous signals to inaction. So President Bolsonaro effectively told communities of would-be forest clearers that they were not going to enforce the forest protection legislation. So effectively opened up, and talked that way about opening up the Amazonian frontier. So the fact that forest fires happened was no surprise. And the fact that the government responded by blaming it on environmentalists was also no surprise, right? So this was like a very intentional, effort to develop in a very short-term and myopic way at the expense of the rights and interests of indigenous peoples in the Amazon. So should the government have acted differently? Absolutely, in every way, almost, both before the fire started and then also afterwards, both because the Amazon is critically important to their own long-term economic health and well-being, because it's a moral imperative from the perspective of their indigenous peoples, and because the Amazon has a unique role in terms of regional and even global climate.
Thank you. Now we still have some questions, but the time is up. So I need to close the session. So Professor Chan, thank you indeed for your kind attendance and extremely valuable inputs from Canada. I wish you a wonderful evening in Vancouver and hope to see you again physically soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, and thank you to everybody for coming.
Now, I would like to invite second keynote speaker, Mr. Hiroto Mitsugi. His lecture title is Why Transformative Change is Necessary to Conserve Forests, Landscapes, and their essential contribution to people. Mr. Mitsugi, please.
So mic was muted. Can you hear me?
Yes, yes.
So could you wait a minute? Well, so thank you, Professor Shibata, and also Professor Ueki, Sophia University. This is quite a good opportunity to us to talking about forestries. And then also I very much appreciate Professor Chan, University of British Columbia's. So to speak out, it's quite comprehensive, also important message to us. So distinguished colleagues and participants, and very much good morning, and good afternoon, and good evening. So it is my great pleasure to be here today for talking about such important the matter of world forestries and discussing future forestry with you. I would like to appreciate Sophia Universities to give these wonderful opportunities. And also I would like to congratulate Sophia Universities to hold 2021 United Nations Week sessions, so which would highlight the important roles and functions of United Nations systems to meet current uncertain international environment, including climate change, COVID-19 pandemic, and the loss of biodiversity, and the conflict, so on. Through the United Nations Week event, I highly expect those participants, in particular the students, would have strong interest to UN systems, and hope some of those will join these systems sooner. Well, as Professor Shibata introduced, I worked for the FAO Forestries, and so as an Assistant Director General for Forestry Department. So now, as a Senior Advisor to Director General of the FAO, I have been involved in the preparation process for the World Forestry Congress, which will be held in May 2022 at the Seoul, Republic of Korea. And also another my mandate is to how to promote FAO partnership with several stakeholders in Japan. So my given theme today is why transformative change is necessary to conserve forest and the landscape and the essential contribution to the peoples. So this is probably could be ecosystem services. So this is a quite a bit long title, and also the content could be very much complicated. So in short, I have to say something on transformation of forest today. Already Professor Shibata showed the necessity of transformation as his introductory speech. And also my previous speakers, Dr. Chan, mentioned several keywords and implications on transformation for biodiversity. And in fact, now we have the COP15 meeting in China. Of course, the second round will be held in the next years, but outcome of IP-based is quite important to be discussed at this COP15 sessions. So in taking account such discussion, also with taking the presentation of Dr. Chan's presentation in your mind, so let's consider the transformation for forest with us. So could you wait a minute? I'm going to share with my presentation papers. Okay, probably you can see the this title, Transformation of Forest, right? So it's the first question. So why we need a transformation for forest? The term of transformation has been often used in the context of Sustainable Development Goals, so UN SDGs. And also often we use this term in climate change matters. And of course, now Dr. Chan mentioned also necessity of transformation in the areas of biodiversity conservation. Because our social system is unsustainable, we heavily rely on that carbon emission economies. To reverse the systems which should become sustainable and carbon-free, even more carbon negatives, we need to seek the system transformations rather than the system improvement. The word of system improvement implies it's doing something at the status quo, but we should change the system itself. Maybe this is some basic concept of transformations. Next slide. So as examples, so let's see the life and the COVID-19 pandemic, what happened. At the end of March 2020, in fact, in the last years, I was in Rome. This is a place for the FAO head office. The city was placed under the lockdown for COVID-19 pandemic. We had no vehicles on road, no people on street. People were only allowed to go to drugstores and the supermarket. Well, as a result, we could enjoy quiet, clear skies and to find out the clear waters in the rivers and noise-free atolls. Suspension of economic activities, including transportation, which decrease its carbon and other emissions, and made us to reconsider the way for achieving SDGs and combating climate change. And of course, a lockdown is an extremely way of social system transformations. But in fact, it showed the several impact of transformation to the environment. It is said that suspension of economic activities by lockdown decreased the carbon emission by 70% over the world. So the ideas of build back better with greens and green recoveries, this is a quite important concept by European Union. It was launched. This is quite based on the fact of transformation, what happened under this lockdown situation of COVID-19. So well, as having the short story of the transformations, I would move on to the main part. First of all, let's look at the status of the world forest and the drivers of deforestation and forest degradations. And also, we'd like to find more. Well, this is the sketches of the status of the world forest. Forests occupy the 30% of the total land areas over the world, so which consists of tropical forest, boreal forest, temperate, and subtropical. About 30% of all type of forest is used primarily for the productions. And about 10% of the world forest is allocated for the biodiversity conservations. Russia, Brazil, Canada, United States, and China are top 5 countries on the forest. They occupied 54% of the world forest. So that this top 5 countries, the magnitude is very much high. You can see Japan, although it is quite a tiny land, but it has a range of the type of forest, from boreal forest to subtropical forest. This is quite unique. I'm sorry. Okay. Now, so in this forest, as you all know, we have is a big function for the biodiversity. So this is a fact. It's a forest as a home to the most of Earth's terrestrial biodiversities, and lots of species of trees and plants, birds, mammals, insects, also soil microbes. So the detailed one already Dr. Chan clearly explained to that. I don't have the much today here. And also let's see the mangrove. So mangrove forests are created in the brackish waters at semi-tropical and tropical areas. On the contrary, that forest land and the mangrove forest is quite rich ecosystem services could be provided. This is a base for the coastal fish and shrimps and shellfish. And also maybe another word, we can say that the mangrove is that the position of interaction between land and waters. So the position is mangrove is quite unique. At the same time, it's quite important home to the marine environment. And also we like to see that the several ecosystem services from the forest. Forests provide us essential services such as absorbing carbon dioxide, providing fresh waters from forest watershed, contributing animal pollinations. This is also mentioned by Dr. Chant, and the mitigation and adaptation of climate change. Most forest carbon is found in the living biomass and also soil organic matters, and with reminders in the dead wood and litter. The total carbon stock is currently in, which means that in 2020, almost 662 gigatons has been stocked in the forest areas. Another important function of forest is on our livelihood and well-being. We are very much heavily rely on that forest. Forests have already been a source of food, incomes, fuel, and shelter for the hundreds of million peoples, creating green jobs, and providing charcoals and firewood as a biomass energies, and also serving several medical plants. These are quite good examples. And also another good unique example in Japan, maybe could be shinrin-yoku or forest bathing. So walking in the woodland and communicating with nature, it makes us to be relaxed. This is also quite important function of forest. So nowadays, so many discussion on urban forest. So how to establish a green belt and also to set up is a park and a wood lot around the cities. So which might contribute the problem of cities. And also forest can provide some healthy services to the people dwellers in urban areas. Well, as we can see, while several benefits from forests are given to us, but negative impact from people are given to the forest. We are facing yet deforestation and the forest degradation at alarming rate over the world. And the annual area of deforestation is almost equal to the area of Costa Rica. So let's see some detail. This graph shows the annual forest area net changed by every decade from 1990 to 2020, and by region from Asia to Africa. You can find increasing forest areas in Asia while decreasing forest areas in both South America and Africa. Particularly Africa has been expanding the loss of forest areas in the past 3 decades. So what is the reason for deforestation? Why does Africa lose this forest? Lost forest means also loss of biodiversity. This is quite critical, also which decreasing the ecosystem service to the peoples. According to the report of Forest Resource Assessment, FAO 2020 and 2015. So this is a quite important flagship report of FAO forestries. This report mentioned that the main drivers of deforestation is agriculture expansion, or we can say that land conversion from forest area to farmland. Among several drivers of deforestation, the proportion of large-scale commercial-based agriculture is 40%, and small-scale subsistence agriculture is 33%. This slide, the highlight is the proportion of deforestation drivers between regions. So the graph, the gray colors means urban expansions, and the yellow color means infrastructure development. Red is mining development. So blue is subsistence agricultures, and orange show the commercial agricultures. The point are a big impact is given to the forest by subsistence agricultures in Africa and by commercial agriculture in Latin America. So probably, so this graph show us the trend, what happens. And also you could find some implication on what we must do for forest and natures. So we are particularly targeting that commodities that are driving deforestation, such as cacao productions, coffee, and cattle grazing, and palm oil productions, and rubber productions. So easily we can imagine that most of us always consume these products as chocolate, coffee, cakes, and soap, and so on. At the same time, this is a quite important ingredient to our life. But at the same time, these products have a quite big impact to the forest and the natures. Well, so this map is quite to have a quite rich, important information on it. So the slide illustrates status to the target indicators SDG 15.1.1. This is a forest area as a percentage of total land areas. And also SDG 2.1.2. So the prevalence of food insecurities. So top one is that showing that the status for SDG 15.1.1, and the bottom one is SDG 2. On the both maps, dark green and green colors indicate the status of improvement or satisfactions. Yellows and red colors are low status. So what you can find from this map? You may easily find South America and Africa. So this is red and yellow colors have been in quite critical situations in food securities and forest deteriorations. Food insecurities imply the necessity to extend agriculture practice more, which will lead further land conversion from forest to farmland. On the contrary, forest deteriorations, this means the loss of ecosystem services, which will affect agriculture product in terms of water supply, soils, and also providing some impact to micro or macroclimate. This is a kind of the vicious cycles. How to stop it? In addition to the previous slide, also I would like to share this information on transition of food insecurities condition in the past 6 years. Year by year, conditions become worse over the world and obviously in Africa and Latin America. So this information coming from that another important flagship report, FAO, State of Food Securities and Nutrition in the World 2020s. The report said that economic stagnations, COVID-19 pandemic, conflict, and climate change, including natural disasters, have pushed this trend. Well, in case of COVID-19, the COVID-19 pandemic is put this worrying trend in overdrives. Up to 811 million people in the world faced hungers in 2020s, a 20% increase in just 1 year. Over 41 million are on the doorstep of starvation. And also you might remember what happened at the beginning of this year. We have locust swarms devastating the crops in the Eastern Africa and also Southeast Asia. We had heat waves, sense of flooding and storms, and also several conflicts we can see at Afghanistan, Myanmar, and other countries and regions, all of which demonstrate the severe impact on our lives and also our food. The global response to these impacts today will determine how we feed and meet of the future generations. So the question is, how do we feed peoples with reversing the loss of forest and the biodiversities? Or how do we reverse the loss of a forest with feeding peoples? Since the past, we foresters have challenged the deforestation as a matter of forestry sectors. For example, expanding protected forest areas, enhancing sustainable forest management, controlling forest disease and forest fires. These are still quite important measures against loss of forest. However, as far as deforestation is caused by agriculture as the main drivers, which lead land use change, we should avoid conflict between the forest and agriculture, and we should consider the way of nexus between forest and food. So this is a current, quite important questions we are confronting. And also the international communities, including scientists, civil societies, and the private sectors now is very much focusing on these matters and try to solve these issues. Well, and I would like to put some explanation from that food system side. A bit far from that firstly, but quite important areas which may give good impact to the forest in futures. On 23rd September 2021, this is just 1 month ago, United Nations held Food System Summit at New York. Over the past 18 months, the summit brought together all UN member states and constituencies around the world, including thousands of youth, food producers, indigenous peoples, civil societies, scientists, private sectors, and consumers, and the United Nations systems to bring about tangibles and positive change to the world food systems. So today, I do not have enough time to explain the details of Food System Summit itself, but the point is, already I mentioned earlier, most of people now facing that food insecurities over the world. And our forecast said it is impossible to achieve SDG 2. So this is a zero hungers by 2030s. And also we are facing that destruction of the natures and biodiversity, including forest. Already also we explained to that. So this is a quite basic background why we have this Food System Summit in these times. So another point is, so that's why the summit recognized agriculture as a drivers of loss of forest and their biodiversity. So then the summit put the boosting nature positive productions into the action track for food system transformations. So each action track is quite mutually linked. For example, sustainable consumptions would decrease food waste and loss, which contribute sustainable productions. So the nexus food and forest has been one of the important topics which will be discussed at COP26, not only by this food system summit, and furthermore, and the second round biodiversity summit, COP15 in the next years. And furthermore, also we are planning to discuss these matters at World Forestry Congress in the next years. So important one is that this is a quite a big trend from the past to the futures. We are talking about food and natures. And so in these positions, so in talking about its SDG matters by 2030s, so we have to carefully looking at that the nexus between food and forest, which should contribute both related SDGs. So time is running. So let's move to the last part. So as we see, not only sustainable forestry management, but also the nexus between forest and food are very much important keyword to us. To enable forest and food to be harmonized, several game changes as a transformative approach are needed, as below you can see. So changing applications of agricultural subsidies. And also my previous speaker, Dr. Chan, mentioned that the issue of subsidies. So nowadays, we are very much how to discuss how to promote the nature positive product using subsidies. Often subsidies has been used for the protecting domestic market against international trade. But now it is a time to use subsidies to foster nature positive agriculture product, which could hold international competitiveness and also maybe changing the value of consumers, which also accelerate this trend. The next one is shortening supply chain. Shortening food supply chains is reduced its carbon footprint and secure local resilience against its climate change and also infectious disease pandemic like COVID-19. All we know that the impact of the pandemic to a supply chain and how we should put on the weight, more weight on that local product and also local consumption rather than global supply chain. So another meaning that putting the weight on the local consumption, local supply, consumer can access and watch the field of productions. So global supply chains tend to make the production field invisible. We should know that impact of production to forest and nature at field. And third one, enhancing the landscape approach. So move to integration from separations. We should adopt the integrated approach to sketch out the total pictures of land use and materialize it. A single and independent approach cannot design, coordinated, and harmonize the landscape which realize nexus between the forest and food and agriculture. And the fourth one, all this effort for integrated approach would maximize benefit, multiple benefit, and not produce the conflict and the competitions among sectors. We shouldn't have a single choice, either food or forest. Should have the multiple choice, food and forest. In short, we might not receive enough benefit, but mid at the long run, we will receive the quite big multiple benefit from integrated approach. And through this all game change effort, this enables us to use nature-based resource in sustainable manners. Okay, so lastly, to the end of my presentations, I put some few key messages to you. So first one is that science-based policy making. Scientific data, information, and scientific analysis proved agriculture as the drivers of deforestation. However, it takes quite a long time to take action at policy level. Quite unfortunately, many decision makers pay little attention on scientific knowledge, but pay much on the public opinions. And this could be understandable, but a big challenge is to pursue the science-based policy making. Under complex and uncertain environment, science should, sorry about it. Can you hear me? Something wrong?
Yes, yes,
Can you see the my slide?
yes.
Okay. So good. So the important one is that the basic challenge of that how to promote science-based policy making is it's quite important to us. At the same time, maybe primarily, this business is owned by the scientist. So which means that how scientists to translate scientific knowledge into a narrative to policymakers. So at the same time, also the scientists and practitioner side try to make a big approach to the decision maker side. This is quite important. And my second message is particularly for the student. And this is quite a simple message, but the content is quite rich. So we must look after forest so that they look after us. So which means that particularly in the youth, this is quite important to own the next generation of forest. So I hope maybe today's audience, particularly for the student, might take this message to in your mind. So that's all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much for your very informative lecture, Mr. Mitsugi. Now we will have a short break, followed by a panel discussion session. If you have questions for Mr. Mitsugi, please put them in Q&A box. They will be picked up at the beginning of the session. We will restart at 10:55. So see you in a few minutes. Okay, now let's start a panel discussion session. Before starting, we have a few questions for Mr. Mitsugi. So let me pick them up. まず最初の質問です。三木先生、ありがとうございます。農業と森林の距離が離れている。そこを融合させることが必要とのことですが、それは具体的にどんなことが挙げられるでしょうか。例えば、森林を開発するのではなく、副草林を適度に残す、すでに大規模農園になっているところに植林をするといったようなことでしょうか。よろしくお願いいたします。
はい、ありがとうございます。一つずつまた答えてばよろしいですかね。まず、この質問ですが、さまざまなケースが考えられると思います。今回の質問されている方が書いてある通りに、森林の開発をしないとかですね、農園の跡地に木々を植えるということもそうだと思います。で、大切なのは、農業サイド、それから林業サイドで個別のアプローチをすることではなくて、両者が一緒になってどういうような景観地を作っていくのか、融合させるのかということを、していくことがとても大事だと思っています。技術的にはおっしゃる通りに、植林をしたり保全したりという取り組みになってきますが、特に2021年から先ほど触れませんでしたけれども、国連の生態系回復の10年ということが言われています。森林もその一つで、フォレストレストレーション、それからランドレストレーションに取り組んでいくということが、今、世界の大きな流れになっています。そのことを含めて、いかに両者を融合させていくかということが問われています。個別具体的な事例については今、お話しする時間ありませんけれども、いろんな国でさまざまな取り組みがすでに行われています。
ありがとうございます。次の質問です。現在の日本のように農地が減る、耕作が放棄される、森林の管理が放置されるといったことが一緒に起こっている国、地域はありますか？そこでの対策はどのようですか？
はい、とても大事な質問だと思います。すべての国のことをつまびらかに知っているわけではありませんが、ただ、私自身が進み聞きした範囲でもこういうことが起きていて、私が今、最近で一番驚いたのはネパールの事例です。ネパールはかつて、今でもですけど、コミュニティフォレストリーが非常に盛んなところで、非常に多くの人たちが薪や炭に燃料を頼っていたわけですけれども、そのために森林がかなり劣化していました。ところが、今ですね、ちょっとこのコロナのせいで少し止まってはいますけども、多くの人が、農村部の若者が都市、あるいはその近隣国、日本を含めて出稼ぎに出ています。その結果、農村部に若者がいなくなっています。かつての日本の経済成長期の農村と同じで、残されているのは子どもと女性と老人だけという状況になっていて、その結果、耕作地はだんだん減ってきて、なおかつ、森林もですね、あまり切らなくなってきたので、元に戻ってきている状況が起きています。で、これむしろ放置されていると言った方がいいかもしれません。で、こういうことが今かなり途上国では特に農村部で若者の人口減ということが日本と同様に進んでいて大きな問題になっています。以上です。
ありがとうございました。もう一つです。農業補助金の出し方、ネイチャーポジティブへの転換は地球レベルではどのようなドライバー、駆動力が期待できるのでしょうか。以前は WTO の貿易交渉がそうだったかと思いますが、現在はどうなのでしょうか。
補助金の話は、先ほどチャン先生の話も出てきましたが、かなり重要でかつ難しい問題だというふうに認識しています。で、特に政治が大きく絡んでくるので、解決は容易ではないのですが、ただ、これ私自身も一昨年から参加していましたが、国連事務総長の下でのワーキンググループの中では、すでに補助金を うまく使わない限り、この問題解決しないだろうという認識が出て、かなり今、加盟国でも共有されつつあります。なので、実はかなり難しいと思ってはいたものの、今、いろんな場でこの議論がされ始めたことによって、もちろん国家間同士でのその意見の対立は当然出てくると思いますが、流れとしては確実に補助金をうまく使っていくという方向に向かっていくと思っています。
ありがとうございました。もう一つあります。三木様、ご講演ありがとうございます。森林のためのトランスフォーメーションのスライドで掲げられていた項目をプラスの方向に進めるためには、現在の市場経済の下でどんなインセンティブが考えられるでしょうか。
はい、先ほどの補助金のこともそうですけれども、実はこのフードシステムサミット自身が、実はこのこともすごく投げかけています。すでにこれも最初のプレゼンテーションでチャン先生が言ってましたが、一つはそのビヘイビアチェンジが当然必要になってくるわけですね。でこれは、生産者も消費者もですし、その中間のマーケットも同じです。いかにその森林にポジティブなものに価値を与えていくのかということが、生産者サイドと消費者サイドが動くことによって市場大きく変わってくると思います。で、これはおそらく他のカーボンの動きと同じで、是非はともかく今 EU が炭素税、国境炭素税をかけようとしていることと同様に、先ほどの補助金も含めて動く可能性があるということと、もう一つは、やはり今、環境問題に対してかなり多くの人たちが関心を抱いていることと同様に、森林を保全するため、より共存するために農産物がどうあるのかということも、この流れの延長線上の中で当然動いていくだろうと思っています。ですから、最終的には生産者にとっても、それから中間トレーダーにとっても、利益の上がるものとして、この動きが捉えられていくというふうに思います。
ありがとうございました。The next question is in English. The nexus between forest and food is relating to achieving the goals of SDG, and balancing the area between forest and farmland is very important. And turning the desert area into farmland is very important by using desalination technology of seawater by Japan. I think this is a not question. This is rather maybe this is a comment. So,
well, I may say some reaction on it. Yeah, this is a fact. It is quite important, and that how to just keep in the balance between forest and food. And of course, the big challenge is the desert areas. And I didn't put on much information that my previous slide, but as I said, 30% of total land is forest. At the same time, 30% of land area is desert. So this is quite a big potential to be developed in futures. So how they combating that is the current climate situation, but the technology can be available to combating desertifications. But maybe also I just recall some memory that what we have is a real convention. So we have biodiversity, climate change, also desertifications. And now we have quite big attention on that, both biodiversity and climate change. But quite unfortunately in Japan, it's a less voice for the desertification matters. So also this is quite important matter. Thank you.
Okay. Now thank you very much. Now we still have some questions, but the time is up. So let's start the panel. First, I'll explain some background to facilitate the discussion. Just a moment, please. The current mass production, mass consumption society, through its socioeconomic activities, destroying the basis of survival of human beings by damaging ecosystems and biodiversity. We need a transition to a sustainable, renewable society in harmony with nature through transformative change. GBO5 report indicated portfolios of actions to reverse the declining trend as shown in the screen. Also, 3 key transitions are proposed for Japanese environmental policy, namely decarbonization, decentralization, and circular economy. GBO5 also provided 8 aspects which require transition. In addition to land and forests, other aspects such as sustainable agriculture, sustainable food, sustainable fresh water, climate action are related to forests. In order to achieve sustainability at global, national level, each region should be sustainable. And for this purpose, at the individual level, we need change of values and lifestyle. At regional level, for example, a circular and ecological economy is proposed in Japan to create a self-reliant, decentralized society by sustainable utilization of ecosystem services and active exchanges between cities and rural villages. Such local transformative changes should lead to the achievement of SDGs. Of course, the situation varies in different parts of the world. In some parts, as was explained by Mr. Mitsugi, severe destruction of forests still continues. And in Japan, for example, forests generally suffer due to lack of human intervention. Today, both keynote speakers coincidentally use the term nature positive. This is probably the key term for the transformative change. I overlaid several keywords provided by Professor Chan and Mr. Mitsugi on this figure. Today's discussion theme is what we can do to promote transformative change in order to conserve forests and ecosystem services. I propose we focus on 3 key questions, namely, what are problems to be tackled and what are available novel solutions? What are necessary considerations and challenges? What can we do as an individual, a citizen, or a consumer? Now, I would like to ask panelists to provide their perspectives. First, Lauren Sensei, could you?
Okay. Thank you very much for inviting me today. I feel very honored, and I would like to share some of my ideas. I hope you can see my slides.
Yes.
Okay. So about the first point, how to achieve a sustainable way of life in forestry. There are various specific actions that have to be taken into account, but on a deeper layer, I think it often results in a patchwork. And what we see is a confusion in overall society. So first, we should review our values towards life as a whole. The world has enough for everyone's need, but not enough for everyone's greed. A famous quotation from Mahatma Gandhi quite some decades ago, and I think it's so true. So the first step is the right comprehension, that we recognize the true values of life. Second is the right experience. How can we experience such values? The third is the right positioning. How can we develop identity? The fourth is the right funding policy. We need incentives for the right actions. And fifth is the right implementation. On-site projects can be a game changer because they become models for the right direction to follow. To go a little bit more in details here, comprehension means what image of man and nature do we carry with us? That starts with environmental education and even spiritual education. For example, Dr. Viktor Frankl from Austria was a psychologist and a very special person who survived the German Nazi concentration camps during World War II, researched a lot about meaning in life. And human beings have three basic aspects: the physical, the mental and emotional, and the higher service, the spiritual aspect. And nowadays we are quite busy with the first two and not with the meaningful life. And second experience, it's only the real life experience that changes people's way of thinking and feeling. You cannot learn nature only from a textbook. So we have a good hopeful movements in kind of child education with the forest kindergartens in Germany, but in many countries, in Japan as well, wilderness schools. We have the tool of organic farming and green tourism, to give some examples. Third point about positioning. Each local community, often they lack pride. They feel like they are late, they're behind because they're not thriving. So we need master plans for sustainable development as an overall approach. And then what kind of life want these communities to live? And to support that things become possible, we need incentives through international, national, regional, and local policy for sustainable development on all levels. So why do the governments not really give incentives for a more sustainable agriculture and forestry? It's just on the beginning. We see some small projects of hope, but it's really not enough. And fifth, the implementation. On-site projects following clear standards and monitoring systems and involve practitioners on the ground can pave the way to become the new model. And what can we do as a citizen? Basically, of course, we need a change in social awareness. And we can make other decisions in a life that is more oriented towards values, because most of us live a consumerist lifestyle. That's the model that we learn from the Hollywood movies and from the magazines, right? Professor Chan mentioned already about that today, that we believe that when we get more in the outside with physical things and with amenities, when we have more pleasure, we will be more happy. And of course, if many people think like this, this is very bad for a sustainable approach. So instead, a more being-oriented lifestyle is about the quality of my own inner state at all my human encounters, including encounters with animals and plants, with the planet. Erich Fromm, back in 1976, wrote a famous book in German, a Swiss scholar of psychology, Haben oder Sein, to have or to be. What kind of person do I want to be? This should be a key question for each of us. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. So Lawrence Sensei, do you want to mention about the questions?
Of course, yes.
Please.
So there was one question from I have to go back in the list. Sorry. Eriko Mukaibo. Thank you very much, Ms. Mukaibo, about how can we be more conscious towards nature. And you mentioned, while in Germany, it helped me thinking about renewable energy. And in the US, people seem to be less nature conscious. And if the society or government doesn't tell you what to do, it's hard to keep in mind about nature. Yes, a very, very good point. Of course, society, the governments and the institutions should do more. Now they don't put nature first. And that's why they are not doing enough. But we cannot wait for our governments. We should start by ourselves. Every person is one of the big. We are part of that. It's not we and everyone the other. We are part of that. So take responsibility for your own life, for your own actions, and open up your senses to any kind of nature that you can experience next to your home, next to your living place. So if you have a chance to enter a forest, it's the best choice. But if you haven't, go to a park. Take time to have contact with nature. And that will become an example for your friends, for your colleagues, for your family. So everyone has kind of responsibility and also opportunity to engage in daily life.
Thank you.
Yes.
So let me ask one quick question. Urban people tend to be thirsty of nature recently, and they are increasingly desiring more connections with nature. Forest bathing, shinrin-yoku, has become popular also in USA and Europe. And in Japan, forest service industry emerged. Do you have any idea to take advantage of such situation for lifestyle and value changes?
Well, I mentioned about kindergartens, the forest kindergartens in Germany. We have more than 1,000 all over the country meanwhile. So this is a very good trend to start at the early childhood education. In Japan, we have more than 100, so it's also growing. Why don't we offer environmental practical experiences for all age groups? So not just forest bathing or forest kindergarten, but for example, companies that make excursions to forests, also to help to prevent the burnout problem that is accelerating and growing. Schools could also include forest days. So if there is a will, there is a way to integrate more nature experience. Because we need the experience, we have to feel it with all senses. The textbook will not rescue us alone. That's my belief.
Thank you. Any comments by panelists? For example, Mr. Mitsugi, please.
Well, thank you very much, and quite impressive that explanation to us. And also just regarding that, there's some forestry education matters in the kindergarten. So I suppose maybe also probably Inoue-san could be involved in the process of forest education programs. This is co-organized by FAO and UFROS and so on. So Germany is quite an important country to support, to promote forestry education. How to just to teach the importance of nature and the forest for the future generation. This is quite important at the same time. Also, this is maybe quite a big entry point to change the behaviors and social norms for the people. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Mitsugi. So, Dr. Inoue, you want to say something? I think your mic is muted.
Sorry, I just wanted to add something to what Mr. Mitsugi-san said. Yes, in Japan, there are increasing number of kindergartens, which is their their buildings of kindergarten is made of wood, and Japanese government provides some subsidies to the wood kindergarten building made of wood. So that is also what Dr. Lawrence suggested, so more experience from the early stage of the life to be much more exposed to natural environment and forest. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Inoue-san. How about Sara? Living in Japan is a bit of changes of lifestyle and value for you. In Fiji, do you think lifestyle and value changes will likely to occur in urban area or among local people?
Thank you very much for the question, Professor. I think, yes, for Fiji, the lifestyle changes when you move from a local community right into the urban community because of the influences that technology raise. But then sometimes it's, I think it goes back to the values that people as an individual, then lifestyle changes, and it somehow have an impact on how they try to look at the natural resources in terms of management. Thank you.
Thank you, Sara. So next, Dr. Inoue, could you show something?
Okay. Thank you very much. Professor Shibata, for giving me an opportunity to take a floor. Sorry. Can you see my presentation file?
Yes, yes.
Okay, so I cannot start my.
Could you put it in a slideshow?
Oh, yes.
Possibly?
Slideshow. Oh, yes. Sorry. Thank you very much. Opportunity to take a floor. I am pleased to see you all today, kindly joining this in very impressive symposium. Thank you all. So I would like to, I think many of you who are joining today are wishing to do something by yourself to save forest and for the sustainable society. So I would like to introduce that the carbon offset schemes that can bridge between those who wish to contribute to save forests and who are in need of help support in the forest areas. By the scheme, the emission of Earth by a 3,000 kilometer car drive can be offset by growing one cashew nut tree's carbon sequestration for 20 years from planting. There are so many carbon offset provider companies around the world who offer the services of these bridges. This is one of the examples in Indonesia. When I worked for the United Nations World Food Program, a Japanese carbon offset provider company, Carbon Free Consulting, kindly invested in our Food for Work project in 2008. Villagers worked very hard for the project. When we revisited 5 years after the project, it was found that the bare land had been changed to be very fertile and productive. When villagers talked to me that they became able to allow their kids to go for higher education opportunities. Introduction of agroecological agroforestry schemes such as terracing for water and erosion control and planting legume species to make their land be nitrogen rich and better yield. Another example from Mozambique in Africa. People had to cut trees to make charcoal and clear out forest because no other alternative income sources available in rural areas. The bridging project by distributing cashew nut trees and moringa tree seedlings, 7 years after the project, we found that some villagers grew them well at schools or in farms with their hard work and improved their living. REDD plus, RED plus, under the Article 5 of the Paris Agreement is a globally agreed mechanism to save forests for climate change mitigation by the bridges between the countries which implement on the ground and the countries which provide support. By positive incentives from result-based payments to the values of reduced emissions by curbing deforestation, countries under the threat of deforestation can take policy approaches of sustainable forest management and ecosystem considered land use. In average, 6 million hectares of forest per year globally, the size of Shikoku and Kyushu of Japan area is vanished by deforestation. It is hoped to stop by RED plus bridges. For further information, please visit our website, ffpri.affrc.go.jp. If you are a student of Sophia or other university, knock at the door of Professor Shibata, who has a long experience on this matter and very fond of nature, as long as I know. Thank you very much.
Thank you for fascinating and encouraging story in Indonesia and Mozambique. Let me ask one quick question. Do you think such carbon offset and integrated food and tree system will be a mainstream in local communities there?
Yes, there are also challenges around there. So local environment always changing. But so in the case of our project in Indonesia, some companies in Japan, such as a bank and so storage control company, so the carbon offset from our project. So I think there are some demand and the supply is increasing. So thank you very much.
Thank you. So Mr. Mitsugi, do you have any comment on her presentation?
Well, thank you very much, and quite a comprehensive one. And so the carbon offset matter is quite still now a big challenge to us. And several things now already we have done, but at the same time, how do we put another value to the RED plus? Maybe another plus could be needed. So maybe this would be that to maybe to take it at the importance of the biodiversity and people's lifestyle and so on. So maybe still now we have quite big streams to how to improve the future idea of the RED plus and plus again. Thank you.
Thank you. Sarah, do you have any comment for Indonesia and Mozambique agroforestry compared with Fiji? I hear that unsustainable production of cover crop often damage watershed, and wondering if agroforestry approach is effective in Fiji too.
Thank you very much, Professor. For Fiji's case, agroforestry more focuses on the agricultural sector rather than the forestry, but at the same time, it's I wouldn't say that it covers or probably a solution to the problem at hand, but somehow it kind of actually solved the problem, which is somehow to solve the problem of a cover problem in the Pacific, especially in Fiji.
Thank you. Thank you. So because of the time, so next, Sarah, could you provide your perspective?
Thank you very much. My presentation is just how to prevent mangrove destruction through sustainable tourism and payment for ecosystem services. And I will be focusing on the case study of Fiji, just to address the question that was posed. I'm so sorry. In Fiji, if you have looked at Fiji, the marine is a vital resources for Fiji's tourism, and tourism is one of that fuel the economy in the country. But that industries and community effort to conserve and improve is largely unrecognized and underutilized in the Fiji tourism marketing. You can see these other tourism. One of the main drivers in eradicating or mangrove destruction in Fiji is development. As you can see, the 3 hotels here, this use claimed land causes of mangrove losses in Fiji. And apart from the other drivers, which is subdivisions and unplanned development and harvesting. But the major problem lies within the policy document, which addresses the issue because of the definitions of mangrove. The current policy that would somehow, maybe the other country are facing as well, is fragmented a range of policy that somehow affected the management of mangrove. And there are no constructive influence on sustainable mangrove management with regards to environmental impact assessment processes. The current challenge also that are faced within the mangrove destruction is the lack of community participation in decision making. Traditional society do not fully understand the scientific explanation of ecosystem interrelationship, and lack of enforcement and monitoring is also one of the major problems that we had the latest problem with one of the island with regards to hotel development. One of the solutions that I brought in was a case study here in Shangri-La, one of the old hotel that had somehow practiced sustainable tourism and worked closely with non-governmental organization and also with the local community, where they come up with practices like coral replanting, mangrove replantations, and that is Shangri-La Hotel, which is actually the main is in Hong Kong and one of the oldest here in Fiji. Even the part of the CSR is watershed project. The recommendation as it is, the current setup is actually marine protected areas as mentioned by Professor Kai, which is the current setup, where local community can work together with NGOs and the hotel that are at hand, where they put a designated area with related to marine activities. So that's where I'm coming from. The solution that I'm actually is the past mechanisms, where ecosystem providers like landowners to improve the marine biodiversity, establishing pay sites, local community activity to monitor, oversee and enforce the no fishing agreement, with the policy to be integrated into, as mentioned in the diagram, where ecosystem users are the resort to provide funding for the establishment, design of MPAs, the CSR budget, which each hotel, like for Shangri-La, it's part of their budget to work with the communities, and it can be included in there, and the payment to the resort, and it goes because from the ecosystem service provider. In one of the major marketing strategy that the hotel in Fiji are using is to use the marine biodiversity to attract tourists into the country. So with that way, it will somehow have impact in terms of the conservation. So one of the implementation challenges are social, ecological, and a governance system in place, which needs to be reviewed in order for the system to work, and how payment could enhance the community well-being, and also collaborative work between communities and resource owners and the NGOs, which are all around Fiji at the moment. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Sarah. Any quick comments by the panelists? Well, actually, now we are very close to the end. If you have any final remark or any message to a young students attending today, please provide. Any final message, remark, or message? Yes, Lauren Sensei.
Okay. I think if we see how big the trouble we are in and the problems that seem quite difficult to solve, we often feel helpless as an individual, and like we feel like it won't make a big difference if I drive a car or not, because all others are driving their car, right? And this is a big problem, because then people give up very early. Everyone has power and can make a difference, and we all have also responsibility to do so. So don't believe that you cannot do anything. It's true that we cannot change the whole system, the political system. It's difficult to change from the individual perspective, but how we live and how we interact is a model for others. When the Green Party started in Germany in the 1980s, people were laughing at them. Ah, the Greens and the ideologists, and they want to live like in the Middle Ages. And the German Chancellor Kohl even said they will be there for 5 years and then they will be gone again. It's just, kind of popular movement. And now the Greens will be in the next German government. They have a 15%. Before they were at 5%. In Austria, it's the same, 15 to 20% of the voters choose for Green. And so it starts in a small scale with a small action. We have seen it with Greta Thunberg. Not everyone has the courage and can do that, what she did. But you can choose a bicycle. You can contact with nature. You can study more sustainable ways. You can choose your subjects at university towards more sustainable ways of life. So you have choices, but you have to become aware of such choices. So follow your interest and be open-minded and don't give up because the problems are so large. That's my message.
Thank you, Lawrence Sensei. So next, Mr. Mitsuki.
Thank you. And quite simple one from me. Well, today's we have is a World Food Days. This is a quite interesting one, World Food Day, but we are talking about forestry. This is quite important. How just bridging the between forest and the food. So this implies that the importance of cross communication. So maybe I would like to propose some of the idea to the student. Please try to make it a good communication with different communities, different division, department, different universities, and outside of the university also quite important. So to having quite good and the futures, it's better to base on that good communication. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Dr. Inoue.
Thank you very much for giving me the last floor. Thank you. So I would like to say that some two quotes from who I very like. So one of them is Dr. Wangari Maathai of Kenya. She said that planting a tree is planting a seed of peace and hope. So I think so nature and society is at the moment human security issue, and so security issue is very important moment. So you can do something by planting one hope of trees. So another quote I would like to tell you is that from Mahatma Gandhi, that is Dr. Lawrence-san also mentioned about Gandhi's quote. So I like the word of him saying that be the change of the world by yourself. So at the moment, because of Corona, many of you cannot go around, but so don't so throw away your hope. Please fly to the world and see the world and be the hope of the world by yourself. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Dr. Inoue. Sarah, just quick one word.
Just a sentence by Stern. The good governance is critical to conservation and the way forward.
Thank you. So at the end of the panel, I try to quickly summarize. Nature positive looks like a common perspective we need. All our actions by individuals, companies, governments, UN, etc., should be nature positive. We should no longer conduct nature negative actions, such as expansion of large-scale agricultural crop production. Nature and wood will be increasingly valuable. Actions by ourselves, companies, governments will soon be evaluated based on nature positiveness. We need to keep in mind a German proverb, because today there are many German-related topics, that forests or nature prefer a world without people. But people cannot live without forests or nature. Hopefully, through the transformative change, we build a world, the forests or nature also require people. Now, we need to close the symposium. I would like to invite Professor Tetsuro Morishita, Vice President of Sophia University, for a closing address. Professor Morishita, please.
Thank you very much, Professor Shibata. First of all, representing Sophia University, I would like to express my sincerest gratitude to Professor Kai Chen and Mr. Hiroto Mitsugi for your giving keynote speeches. I'd like to express my heartfelt appreciation to Professor Lawrence Pogendorf, Dr. Inoue, and Ms. Sui Suver for your contribution as panelists. Also, I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to all participants. Thank you very much. Lots of insightful comments and questions. I believe that you, and I hope you enjoyed this symposium, a very valuable symposium. I understand that one of the key messages today is that we need to transformative change, not incremental change, for our future and for our forest. I believe that we have been given a very valuable opportunity to think deeply about what we can do and what we should do to achieve this. I understand that this is not an easy problem, easy challenge, and there are many difficult issues to be solved. However, I believe that it is time for the world and for us to work together to overcome these challenges and realize transformative changes. It is a mission of universities to create a future for younger generations, and I believe that it is a role of universities to tackle such difficult issues as discussed today for our future and for our forest. Sophia University has a rich global network and has also been focusing on research and education on environmental issues and sustainability. I feel that today's topic is exactly the kind of issue that Sophia University should do its best to address. As a vice president in charge of matters relating to sustainable future and SDGs, I'd like to consider what Sophia University could and should do to continuously make solid contribution. I hope that today's symposium would serve as a chance for us to take concrete action that can contribute to a sustainable future. Thank you very much all. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Professor Morishita. This is the end of the symposium. I would like to say sincere thanks to all the panelists for your kind attendances and invaluable inputs. I also would like to say thank you for the participants to attend until the end. I hope you enjoy the symposium and see you soon in the next opportunity. Thank you very much. ありがとうございました。